Detective Isaac Barnett had just finished one of his longest shifts on record, longing for a night of undisturbed rest. He pulled into the quiet driveway of his quaint suburban house, the place he thought would offer a break from the challenges of law enforcement. Yet, as he stepped out of his car, he heard an odd clanging sound. Rounding the corner of his garage, he froze at the sight of a woman, later identified as Lenora Billings, smashing away at his solar panels with a hammer. Initially struck by disbelief, Isaac took a second to process the surreal image before him. Lenora, dressed in casual attire and wearing a look of grim determination, seemed wholly absorbed in her task. Shards of tempered glass from the damaged panels littered the ground, crunching underfoot as she continued her assault. When she sensed Isaac's presence, she paused momentarily, turning to face him with a glare that suggested she'd been waiting for this confrontation. There was a flicker of recognition. Isaac realized he knew Lenora from brief neighborly interactions that never hinted she'd be capable of such extreme behavior. She had once complained about any perceived eyesore, from fence heights to lawn decorations, but he never imagined it would escalate to outright vandalism. In an instant, his fatigue vanished, replaced by the focused mindset he employed on duty. "Stop!" Isaac commanded, keeping his voice firm yet controlled. He watched Lenora hesitate, then resume hammering, as if doubling down on her actions. Without waiting, he pulled out his phone, switching it to record the incident. Documenting a crime in progress was second nature to him as a detective. Beyond that, though, he knew that once a scene escalated, evidence would be crucial in establishing how and why such a strange attack occurred. Lenora shouted something unintelligible about the ugliness of the panels and how they devalued her property. It became evident that, in her mind, Isaac was the offender. Someone who'd marred the neighborhood's aesthetic with these modern contraptions on the roof. Her tirade soon veered into personal territory, laden with unsettling undertones that Isaac recognized as deeper than a mere property dispute. While fatigue weighed on him, professional instincts kicked in. He had to remain composed, for his own sake and to ensure that justice followed a lawful course. Moments later, the clash of metal on glass subsided. With the phone's camera pointed steadily at Lenora, Isaac announced his identity. He was a detective working with the local police force. Her expression flickered with a mix of surprise and defiance. It was as though she realized, too late, that her victim had the resources to hold her accountable. Yet, neither shock nor regret tempered her hostility. She sneered and spewed words that straddled the line between resentment and something far more disturbing. Standing in his own yard, Isaac felt an unexpected swirl of emotions. Anger at the senseless destruction, disbelief at the brazenness, and a touch of sadness that a neighborly bond, however superficial it might have been, had devolved into criminal behavior. As shards crunched underfoot, he steadied his phone, knowing that the footage he captured at this moment would play a crucial role in deciding how a quiet detective's life converged with the sudden violence of an enraged neighbor. In the days after Detective Isaac Barnett discovered Lenora Billings destroying his solar panels, he began to piece together her past grievances. Though their earlier interactions had been minimal, Isaac now realized that Lenora harbored a long-standing resentment that extended beyond a single act of vandalism. Conversations with neighbors revealed how, for months, she had been waging minor battles against multiple households in Bluefield Meadow, latching onto the smallest offenses in the name of maintaining community standards. At first, Isaac figured Lenora's fixation on his property might center on some perceived intrusion, like the solar panels marring her view, but it soon became clear that her range of complaints was wider. She had a habit of citing obscure or outdated HOA bylaws whenever she disapproved of something, from lawn ornaments to small architectural quirks. In fact, rumor had it she'd once attempted to fine a neighbor for planting wildflowers that clashed with the manicured look of the subdivision. No one took these citations too seriously, but they established her reputation as a self-appointed enforcer of aesthetic norms. Word of the vandalism spread quickly among the residents. Some, having faced Lenora's wrath over trivialities, expressed little shock that she had escalated to property damage. A few of them quietly approached Isaac, sharing their experiences and urging him to be cautious. One woman confessed that Lenora had threatened to report her to the HOA for violating yard decor rules when she displayed a small birdbath. Another recalled how she'd received a strongly worded letter about the color of her porch light. To outsiders, these disputes seemed petty, but in the bubble of Bluefield Meadow, they became sources of real tension. For Isaac, these revelations painted a disturbing pattern. Lenora's hostility wasn't triggered solely by the solar panels, it was part of a broader campaign to mold the neighborhood to her liking. Yet, she had chosen the wrong person to intimidate this time. As a detective, Isaac possessed the resources and training to follow through on legal recourse, and the phone recording of Lenora's vandalism gave him ample evidence should he opt to press charges. He mulled over how best to proceed. A direct confrontation could inflame the situation, potentially putting him on the defensive if Lenora twisted the narrative. Filing a straightforward police report was an option, but Isaac hesitated, mindful of how a formal arrest might affect the quiet equilibrium he cherished at Bluefield Meadow. Would pursuing justice risk further antagonizing Lenora, and, by extension, any neighbors loyal to her stance? In the end, Isaac decided to keep thorough documentation of every complaint, message, or conversation he had regarding Lenora's activities. He reasoned that a measured approach, grounded in unassailable facts, would serve him better than a knee-jerk reaction. After all, any hasty move could give Lenora ammunition to paint him as the aggressor. For the moment, Isaac would observe, gathering details on her pattern of complaints across the subdivision, and carefully plan his next steps. Amid this simmering tension, he sensed that the conflict was far from over, and that further escalation was just a matter of time. Not long after the vandalism incident, Lenora Billings took it upon herself to justify her actions in the court of neighborhood gossip. Determined to control the narrative, she cornered anyone willing to listen, on sidewalks, at the local cafe, and even during HOA gatherings. With animated gestures and a raised voice, she insisted that Detective Isaac Barnett's solar panels were not only ugly but detrimental to property values throughout Bluefield Meadow. From Lenora's perspective, her hammer-wielding scene was not an act of vandalism but a necessary intervention, a service, in her words, to keep the community upscale. She recast herself as a victim, claiming she felt intimidated by Isaac's position in law enforcement. According to her retelling, the panels were a front for some suspicious operation, or at least an affront to the neighborhood's harmony. She even leaned on questionable remarks implying Isaac, with his background and line of work, might not fit the community's ideal. Occasionally, her statements bordered on racist undertones, an ugly edge that only further concerned those listening. Isaac, from his vantage point, saw how Lenora tried to reframe her role from perpetrator to whistleblower. He heard secondhand from neighbors how she labeled him aggressive or uncooperative whenever someone mentioned his name. Yet, her story had glaring inconsistencies. She never explained why, if she truly felt threatened by Isaac, she'd chosen to trespass onto his land late at night with a hammer. Nor did she address how she'd brushed aside all the official channels, like filing a complaint with the HOA or consulting with local authorities, before resorting to outright destruction of property. Still, a few residents drank in her version of events, either out of fear or loyalty to the perceived community aesthetic. They whispered about Isaac's mystery background, ignoring that he'd been open about being a detective. Perhaps the allure of controversy attracted them to Lenora's tale, or maybe they found the dryness of everyday suburban life so stifling that they welcomed a sensational rumor. Meanwhile, those better acquainted with Isaac dismissed Lenora's claims as theatrics, recalling how he'd introduced himself politely upon moving in, even inviting neighbors over for a small barbecue to foster goodwill. Amid the swirling commentary, Isaac opted for steady restraint. He posted no public rebuttals on social media, nor did he confront Lenora's supporters in heated arguments. Instead, he kept detailed logs of everything said about him, both supportive and critical. He reasoned that any direct clash would only feed Lenora's narrative. If the matter escalated to legal proceedings, his catalogue of evidence would contrast starkly with her hearsay-laden accusations. For her part, Lenora seized every opportunity to spin new rumors. She alleged that Isaac was using his position in law enforcement to bully her into silence, or that he intended to transform his home into some covert base, unsubstantiated claims that never quite stuck. Yet the very mention of such speculation proved how far she was willing to stretch the truth. In the hush of each quiet evening at Bluefield Meadow, Isaac heard faint echoes of gossip floating through the warm breeze, reminders that while he maintained calm, Lenora was busy fueling the next wave of neighborhood drama. The uneasy truce between Detective Isaac Barnett and Lenora Billings came to a head one afternoon when a new wave of tension erupted. It began with a frantic 911 call. Lenora, breathing heavily into the phone, claimed there was a suspicious man skulking around her property, allegedly trying to break in. She identified him as the same neighbor whose solar panels she'd recently inspected with a hammer. According to her panicked tone, he was now retaliating, threatening her safety. When the dispatcher relayed the details to local patrol units, they recognized the address in Bluefield Meadow. The mention of a detective living on the same street raised eyebrows, prompting the responding officers, Officers Diaz and Reynolds, to approach the scene with caution, uncertain whether it was indeed a credible emergency or yet another twist in Lenora's continuing drama. Meanwhile, Isaac was inside his home, tidying the living room after some minor remodeling. A sudden rap on the door accompanied by muffled radio chatter alerted him that law enforcement had arrived. Steeling himself, he opened the door to find the pair of officers, hands resting casually near their belts. "Sir, we received a call from Ms. Billings," Officer Diaz began, exchanging a glance with her partner. "She claims you were seen attempting to break into her house. Care to explain?" Isaac suppressed an exasperated sigh, recalling how these same officers had previously visited the area after the solar panel incident. This time, though, he had an advantage: the front yard camera he'd recently installed. He calmly invited them to step around the corner where a small monitor displayed a feed from earlier in the day. Rewinding the footage, Isaac showed them that at the exact time Lenora claimed he was lurking, he was actually walking from his mailbox back to his porch, never once setting foot near her property line. The images were crystal clear, no sign of suspicious or menacing behavior. The officers, seeing the crisp footage and comparing it to the 911 timeline, exchanged knowing looks. This wasn't their first brush with a neighbor dispute devolving into false police reports, but the level of distortion in Lenora's account struck them as particularly excessive. To confirm, they walked to Lenora's place, only to find her standing outside, phone in hand, practically trembling with manufactured outrage. She launched into a spiel about feeling terrified and harassed. Yet, when Officer Reynolds asked for any video or eyewitness accounts to corroborate her story, she faltered. No direct proof existed. She started referencing trivial occurrences, like strange sounds she heard from Isaac's house a few nights prior, or how she'd noticed him lurking by the fence that morning. The officers grew visibly skeptical, especially when she failed to explain how she could see him prowling behind her garage at the precise moment the camera footage showed him at his own mailbox, a considerable distance away. Confronted with the contradiction, Lenora's voice wavered. She insisted that the presence of an HOA resolution demanded something be done about Isaac's unneighborly activities, but she never named a specific violation. When Officer Diaz confronted her about the earlier vandalism claims, reminding her that she'd been caught on camera destroying solar panels, Lenora retreated into a defensive posture, deflecting by referencing her emotional distress over the entire ordeal. In a calm but unyielding tone, the officers explained they would have to file a report documenting this false police call. Falsely reporting a crime was no trivial matter, especially since she'd singled out Isaac repeatedly without evidence. "We're obligated to record your statement and compare it with the video proof we've seen," Officer Reynolds said, making it clear that her allegations were teetering on the edge of unlawful claims. The word misdemeanor surfaced in their conversation, implying that if she persisted in conjuring false narratives, the next step could be legal charges. Lenora's bravado slipped momentarily, her bravado giving way to a flash of genuine worry. She realized she stood on precarious ground. Nonetheless, she refused to admit any wrongdoing. Instead, she stormed off, muttering that the HOA would hear of this and that the entire neighborhood would pay attention to Isaac's alleged improprieties. The officers, unfazed by her threats, took down final notes and advised Isaac to keep his camera footage safe in case future complaints warranted additional evidence. Though relieved that the immediate crisis had passed, Isaac recognized that each false alarm strengthened the case against Lenora. If she continued inventing scenarios for the police, her credibility would eventually crumble, leaving her vulnerable to real consequences. He also felt a twinge of pity at how readily she manipulated the emergency system for personal vendettas. Even so, pity didn't diminish the frustration he harbored for the relentless attempts to tarnish his reputation. Once the officers left, Isaac stood in his living room, gazing at the flickering feed from the front yard camera. The tension in the air remained thick, overshadowed by a sense of waiting for the next shoe to drop. What new scheme might Lenora conjure up next? He realized that ignoring her was no longer an option. She had proven capable of outright lies that could jeopardize his standing or, worse, put him in legal jeopardy. With that in mind, Isaac resolved to strengthen his documentation even further, ensuring that if she escalated again, he would have an unassailable record of her duplicity. Determined to protect himself from the repeated allegations, Detective Isaac Barnett made a strategic move. He collected all the video evidence he had gathered so far, recordings of Lenora Billings vandalizing the solar panels, her contradictory statements on the sidewalk, and her half-baked claims caught on his newly installed surveillance camera. Though reluctant to spark another confrontation, Isaac recognized that building a solid legal case was the surest way to prevent Lenora from exploiting the system or tarnishing his reputation further. He visited the local station on a quiet weekday afternoon, binder in hand. Familiar with the layout and protocol, being part of the broader law enforcement community himself, Isaac navigated to a contact officer who specialized in neighborhood disputes and property crimes. Presenting the footage, he methodically outlined the sequence of events, from the moment he found Lenora hammering at his solar panels, to the night she falsely called 911. The difference now was that each incident was meticulously time-stamped and documented, painting a compelling picture of her pattern of harassment. The reviewing officer looked increasingly astonished as the details piled up. "We have enough here for felony vandalism," he remarked. "The damage to those panels isn't minor, and we can't ignore her repeated attempts to draw police on false pretenses." Tapping a few keys on the computer, the officer cross-referenced any prior complaints from or about Lenora. Her name popped up multiple times, from smaller disputes about fence lines, to bigger rants about alleged misconduct that always proved unfounded. This track record bolstered the seriousness of Isaac's complaint. While official wheels turned, Isaac maintained a low profile, going about his detective work quietly. He confided in a close colleague or two about the bizarre feud swirling around his personal life. They sympathized, acknowledging that a stable personal environment was crucial for someone in a high-stress profession like policing. The mere fact that a neighbor had singled him out so aggressively, willing to commit property damage and spin falsehoods, unsettled them all. Only a few days later, the department, armed with Isaac's evidence and a formal statement from local wildlife authorities about the suspicious introduction of snakes, a separate matter under investigation, decided it had enough to place charges. They arranged a discreet plan. Officers would arrive at Lenora's home with a warrant for her arrest, ensuring no chance of last-minute theatrics in which she might destroy further evidence or attempt to flee. That morning, as dawn cast faint light across Bluefield Meadow, a pair of marked cruisers rolled onto Lenora's street. The uniformed officers stepped out, accompanied by a plainclothes detective. Lenora Billings, apparently preparing for another day of dispatching petty complaints, opened her door to find the small group on her front step. Startled, she tried to shut the door, but an officer placed a firm hand against it, calmly informing her she was under arrest for felony vandalism and filing a false police report. Neighbors watched from behind curtains and across lawns, stunned by the sudden turnaround. For those who had grown weary of Lenora's tyranny, the sight of her in handcuffs was both shocking and oddly vindicating. She protested vociferously, claiming the evidence had been fabricated, that she was the true victim here. But the calm recitation of Miranda rights and the mention of video proof deflated her arguments. Even a few passers-by who had once supported Lenora appeared uncomfortable, unsure what to believe in the face of so much damning evidence. Isaac, for his part, stood at a respectful distance, arms folded. He hadn't come to gloat, his presence was required mostly because the investigation touched on property crimes against him. Despite the swirl of tension, he felt a measure of relief as he watched the officers lead Lenora away. It signaled the end of a cycle of intimidation that had begun with hammered solar panels and ended in allegations of false threats. He also felt a pang of regret that matters had escalated to the point of an actual arrest, but he knew well that letting such behavior slide would only invite further harassment or even bolder acts of vandalism. In the hush that followed, a small crowd approached Isaac, neighbors who had seen everything. Some offered terse nods, reflecting on how quickly one person's vendetta could unravel an entire community's sense of peace. Others gave him words of gratitude, remarking that they too had felt the sting of Lenora's intrusions but never mustered the courage to push back. Isaac nodded politely, acknowledging their sentiments. Returning home, he gazed at the battered remains of the solar panels, still awaiting proper replacement after the initial damage. The net cost to repair them was steep, not to mention the emotional toll from constant strife. Yet, in that moment, he recognized the entire ordeal had a silver lining. By standing up for himself legally, he'd effectively drawn a line in the sand, demonstrating that no amount of intimidation or false accusations could trump factual, documented evidence. With Lenora's arrest, the immediate danger had passed, but Isaac suspected more complexities might lie ahead. Would she attempt to fight the charges, further contorting the narrative? Or would she eventually concede, letting the legal system run its course? The only certainty was that Isaac had chosen justice over appeasement, and in doing so, had reclaimed his right to a peaceful life, one where hammered solar panels and midnight calls to 911 wouldn't overshadow the simple joys of a quiet suburban existence. With Lenora Billings now in custody, many in Bluefield Meadow assumed the drama would dissipate, replaced by a more placid daily routine. Yet, to the surprise of some, it was merely a new chapter in the ongoing saga. Upon posting bail, Lenora resumed her confrontation with a vengeance, publicly decrying the injustice of her arrest, and labeling Detective Isaac Barnett a manipulative figure who framed her for property damage she claimed was blown out of proportion. Her initial bravado had hardly tempered under the threat of legal repercussions. Word soon reached Isaac that Karen, as she was still known in official HOA capacity, despite her real name being Lenora Billings, had begun pulling strings to hold an impromptu neighborhood assembly. She framed it as a forum to share her side of the story and restore trust in the HOA, as if she were a victim of some elaborate plot. Despite her tarnished reputation, a handful of curious residents decided to attend, either seeking clarity or simply hoping to witness the spectacle of her outlandish claims. Realizing he couldn't afford to ignore these developments, Isaac decided to quietly show up, prepared with factual documentation should she attempt to rewrite events yet again. Late afternoon found him seated at the rear of the community clubhouse, a battered folder of notes on his lap, while a small group of neighbors murmured among themselves. In front stood Karen, sporting a brittle smile, launching into a self-pitying monologue about the slander and defamation she believed she faced. She tapped heavily on a microphone, the feedback momentarily piercing the hush. "I have served this community diligently. Any accusations of criminal behavior are baseless," she declared. She went on to discredit the footage of her hammering the solar panels, labeling it dubious editing. She dismissed the police statements as a coordinated attempt to sabotage her. The more she spoke, the more Isaac noted how precarious her logic appeared to those watching, who'd already heard the opposite story from a credible detective. Some neighbors exchanged doubtful glances, while others shook their heads. Eventually, Isaac felt compelled to stand and address her claims directly. Keeping his tone measured, he reminded the assembly that a thorough police investigation had occurred, culminating in Lenora's arrest on charges that included vandalism and making false reports. He pointed out that there was verified video from multiple angles, footage so clear that officers had no trouble validating his account. If any errors existed, they were in Karen's spin, not in the official record. She met his remarks with scorn, retorting that everyone knows video can be doctored, and that she had intelligence, pointing to a wider conspiracy to rid Bluefield Meadow of devoted guardians of the HOA. She even tried to evoke racial or cultural biases, insinuating that Isaac's background might be reason enough for suspicion, though she'd never present this argument outright. The crowd, having grown weary of her tangents, mostly looked on in silence. Some, especially those who once admired her zeal for rules, now recognized her manipulations more clearly. As the meeting wound down, Karen's attempt to sway hearts and minds faltered. Though she mustered every ounce of drama she could, the facts overshadowed her performance. The exhausted sigh of the crowd told Isaac that her tactics weren't winning. The HOA leadership, newly cautious about backing her after the fiasco, ended the session by acknowledging the matter was under legal adjudication. They would not wade into claims that contradicted confirmed police findings. In the quiet aftermath, Isaac found himself approached by a few neighbors offering quiet support. Some apologized for doubting him or for not speaking out when Lenora's meddling first surfaced. He graciously accepted their sentiments, not wanting to fault them for being cautious. Everyone, it seemed, was gradually recognizing how a single determined individual could create chaos if left unchallenged. Yet despite the small wave of validation, Isaac's reflection on the entire conflict remained tinged with sadness. What should have been an uneventful suburban life had devolved into a cycle of accusations, arrests, and public meetings, an ordeal that tested not only his patience but also the neighborhood's sense of unity. He recognized that while her emergency meeting had failed to absolve her of wrongdoing, Karen might continue stoking controversies. That night, returning to his modest house, Isaac watched the sun set behind the battered remains of his solar panels, still awaiting repair after her initial assault. The scene reminded him how quickly normalcy could shatter under the weight of one person's vendetta. Yet, he also realized that his quiet resilience and methodical approach had carried him through. The final resolution might still hinge on the courts, but at least he'd confronted her attempts to warp the narrative. He locked the door with a sense of weary relief, mindful that while the confrontation had escalated, truth and evidence thus far had stood firm against Karen's manipulations. With the initial charges filed against Lenora Billings, stemming from vandalism of the solar panels and false police reports, Detective Isaac Barnett settled into a cautious routine at Bluefield Meadow. He stayed vigilant, suspecting that Lenora might still attempt to retaliate out of desperation or to salvage her crumbling reputation. Yet, even as he anticipated new drama, a surprising development in the investigation brought old skeletons from Lenora's past into the open, compounding her already precarious legal situation. It started when local detectives, collaborating with prosecutors, began combing through any prior incidents involving her. They uncovered a trove of official complaints and archived statements, some lodged by neighbors in her previous communities, others referencing racial or cultural biases. The deeper the team dug, the clearer it became that Lenora's animosity towards certain individuals went beyond petty HOA matters. In multiple cases, complainants cited racist remarks or discriminatory behaviors. Although none of these earlier episodes had escalated into formal hate crime charges, they now painted a broader context for her hostility toward Isaac, who came from a background different than her own. As the prosecutors debated how to frame the case in court, the discovery of these biases made them consider adding hate crime enhancements to Lenora's charges. If they succeeded in proving her vandalism and false reporting were motivated by prejudice, her penalties could increase substantially. This shift elevated the case's profile from a local dispute to a matter with broader social implications. For Isaac, the revelation came with mixed emotions. On one hand, it corroborated his suspicion that Lenora's actions weren't just about property or aesthetics. She had, at times, insinuated that his presence in the neighborhood was unsettling, though she couched such phrases in coded language. On the other hand, the knowledge that her prejudice ran deep cast a grim shadow over the entire saga, one that made him uneasy about how far she might go if cornered. Still, as a detective, he believed in the power of facts to shape outcomes, trusting that a transparent legal process would expose the full truth. To bolster the prosecution's case, Isaac cooperated by providing any relevant data he had gathered, video proof of her damaging the panels, recordings of her unsubstantiated calls to 911, and statements from neighbors who had witnessed her more overt biases. The more evidence compiled, the stronger the argument that her behavior toward Isaac wasn't random but part of a longer pattern. A sense of momentum built among the investigating officers. This wasn't just about delivering justice for the hammered solar panels, but also about confronting a pattern of discriminatory behavior. Word spread among neighbors that the charges might carry a hate crime dimension. Reactions varied. Some expressed dismay that prejudice still festered so close to home, while others breathed relief that the law might address not only property damage but also the deeper bigotry fueling it. A portion of Bluefield Meadow residents, previously silent about Lenora's microaggressions, felt emboldened to come forward with stories of their own. One described how Lenora had privately chided her for having the wrong sorts of friends over for a barbecue, couched in the language of keeping the neighborhood's character intact. In the midst of this, Isaac tried to maintain humility. While grateful for the community's support, he recognized that a trial would not be easy. Lenora's defense attorney would likely attempt to depict him as a vindictive officer, leveraging his position to suppress a neighbor's dissent. Yet, he saw that approach losing steam against the mountain of objective proof. The attorney might try calling the racism angle an overreach or claim Lenora's prior statements were misunderstandings, but eyewitness testimonies and reams of logs told a more consistent story. Lenora, for her part, reappeared sporadically in local online forums, furiously denying any wrongdoing. She labeled the discovery of her past remarks as irrelevant personal attacks, and accused the system of ganging up on her. If anything, these rants only solidified the perception that she was unwilling to acknowledge the line between personal preference and illegal acts. The more she typed, the more certain the authorities felt about pursuing the added hate crime charge. Sensing that the net around her was tightening, Lenora eventually tried a new tack, lamenting on social media about how an innocent homeowner had been singled out by a detective bent on achieving a career milestone. She framed it as a personal vendetta orchestrated by Isaac to climb the professional ladder. However, these claims struck most as contradictory to her earlier stance, where she insisted he was incompetent or sneaky. The contradictory nature of her own statements did more to erode her credibility than save it. All the while, the local detective bureau and prosecutors hammered out the final components of the case. They met with Isaac frequently, ensuring no detail was overlooked. They even consulted a civil rights specialist to confirm that the hate crime allegation fit the legal definition. Each planning session brought them closer to finalizing an airtight prosecution strategy. The date for Lenora's arraignment approached, and the rumor mill buzzed. Would she accept a plea deal to avoid a lengthy trial, or force a public spectacle? For Isaac, the question wasn't whether justice would be served, but how many layers of leniency she might attempt to exploit. He'd witnessed countless individuals try to salvage their image through claims of remorse or ignorance, but with each new revelation about her extremist attitudes, it seemed less and less likely that she'd walk away with a slap on the wrist. His part in the ordeal was nearly complete. He'd provided the proof, endured the harassment, and shown restraint under immense pressure. The final step was letting the court see that the vandalism, the false accusations, and the bigotry all formed a cohesive mosaic, one that ended with Lenora Billings facing the full weight of the law she once pretended to champion. The wheels of justice turned briskly once the evidence fully emerged against Lenora Billings. Investigators presented a wealth of material: her repeated harassment of Detective Isaac Barnett, video evidence of her hammering away at his solar panels, documented phone calls to 911 with fabricated allegations, and the newly uncovered bigotry in her background. With hate crime enhancements added to the vandalism and false reporting charges, Lenora's legal team found themselves in an increasingly difficult position. When the trial date arrived, the proceedings drew a notable crowd, both neighbors from Bluefield Meadow and curious onlookers from nearby communities. Many wanted to see how the court would handle such an unusual blend of property disputes, personal vendettas, and underlying racial bias. Over a few tense days, prosecutors methodically laid out Lenora's record of aggression and prejudice, culminating in the night she introduced snakes onto Isaac's property and later, the solar panel incident. The final blow came from direct testimonies of her repeated attempts to cleanse the neighborhood of elements she disliked, often targeting those different from herself. When sentencing time came, the judge delivered a clear message. Such acts of vandalism and false allegations had no place in civil society, and the hate crime factor only exacerbated the harm. Lenora received a 5-year prison sentence, to the audible gasps of some in the gallery. The penalty dwarfed anything she might have expected, a stark reminder that crossing certain lines carried severe consequences. In Bluefield Meadow, news of Lenora's sentencing traveled swiftly. A wave of relief washed over those who had silently endured her tyranny, neighbors who lived in fear of her random citations or lawn critiques. Many felt validated that justice recognized the pattern of intimidation disguised as HOA concerns. Meanwhile, Isaac was lauded for maintaining composure throughout. The local press cast him as a figure of measured resolve, praising him for letting the evidence, not personal vendetta, guide the case. Some residents, still a bit stunned by the severity of Lenora's punishment, questioned whether 5 years was excessive. They sympathized with the notion that her misguided sense of aesthetic purity or neighborly authority had spiraled out of control, but it was never meant to cause such havoc. Yet, any reservations they had were quelled by the reality that her actions, especially with the addition of hate crime charges, had inflicted serious psychological and financial damage, not only on Isaac but also on others who felt marginalized by her biases. Isaac, for his part, humbly thanked those who provided witness statements and moral support. He insisted he hadn't sought retribution, only a fair resolution that upheld his rights and safety. As he returned to normalcy, he replaced the smashed solar panels at last, their gleaming new surfaces standing as a quiet testament to perseverance. Life in the neighborhood, minus Lenora's disruptive presence, began to settle into the calm he had always hoped to find. And though the memory of her extreme tactics lingered, Bluefield Meadow collectively turned a page, hopeful that the worst chapter of their local drama had finally ended. In the aftermath of Lenora Billings' sentencing, life at Bluefield Meadow underwent a quiet transformation. With the neighborhood's longtime agitator removed, many residents felt an unusual peace settle over their daily routines. Gone were the days of unexpected phone calls to the police or last-minute HOA, emergency meetings, demanding compliance over trivial matters. The air felt lighter, as though everyone could finally breathe without fear of an unwarranted complaint slipping under their door. Lenora herself, stripped of her illusions of control, languished in prison. The once vocal presence who had dominated local conversations found herself in a stark new reality, unable to influence or override the community she had terrorized for so long. Rumor had it she lost her house to foreclosure, as legal costs stacked higher than she could manage. The property would presumably be sold or repurposed, a final nail in the coffin of her illusions of supremacy. Meanwhile, Detective Isaac Barnett experienced a wave of community appreciation and personal reflection. While he was glad to have resolved the conflict, he took little pleasure in Lenora's personal downfall. Instead, he used the incident to reaffirm his stance against prejudice and for neighborly coexistence. Privately, he pledged to maintain a vigilant watch for any future signs of harassment or bigotry, either in Bluefield Meadow or elsewhere, and to intervene with the same calm determination he had shown when dealing with Lenora. The local media also highlighted Isaac's role in bringing justice. Articles framed him as a symbol of reason, a man who refused to respond to intimidation with anger. Some commented that a quiet detective, used to operating behind the scenes, had stepped into the public eye for a brief moment, only to remind everyone that abiding by the law and upholding community values went hand in hand. For Isaac, the recognition felt awkward, yet he accepted it gracefully, preferring that the spotlight move on soon enough. With each passing day, as new families moved into the area, the sense of normalcy deepened. Neighbors resumed friendly sidewalk chats, ignoring the old fear that a simple conversation might wind up in Karen's next complaint. The HOA restructured itself, clarifying rules to discourage any single member from abusing their position. At some gatherings, people still shared the story of Lenora's meltdown, how it began with hammered solar panels and ended with felony charges, laughing at the absurdity while acknowledging the cautionary lesson. Through it all, Isaac remained quietly at the heart of the community, continuing to serve as a detective, encouraging an ethos of fairness and respect. The ordeal, though harrowing, galvanized him to become even more active in neighborhood affairs, lending his voice to anti-discrimination initiatives and volunteering time for local youth programs. If anything, he viewed the entire chapter as confirmation that small actions, like capturing a crucial video or reporting wrongdoing, could have immense impact. Though the cost was high, the final outcome was a testament to how a single individual could stand firm against intimidation, rewrite a toxic narrative, and restore a measure of peace to the place he called home. As the final court hearing approached, the local community buzzed with discussions of Lenora Billings' fate. She faced multiple convictions: vandalism against public utilities, false reporting, and, with the newly surfaced prejudicial context, a hate crime enhancement. Speculation about the precise length of her sentence ran wild, but few expected the judge to show leniency after the evidence revealed a pattern of intimidation and harassment culminating in destructive acts. Sure enough, the ruling was firm. Lenora received a 5-year prison sentence, underscoring the severity of her offenses. The day she stood in the courtroom, wearing a subdued expression, felt surreal to those who had once known her as a controlling neighbor who brandished every little regulation as a weapon. Where she once demanded absolute compliance with her vision of a pristine neighborhood, she now found herself under the rigid control of the penal system. For Detective Isaac Barnett, the conclusion brought mixed feelings. On one hand, he was relieved that justice had been served and that no further residents would endure her targeted aggression. On the other, the entire saga had left a sobering reminder of how personal vendettas could escalate into life-changing consequences. He never took pleasure in her downfall, rather, he saw it as a necessary corrective to her disregard for law and decency. In the aftermath, the local press framed Isaac's stoic approach as the driving force behind Lenora's exposure. Articles, blog posts, and even local talk shows highlighted how a calm, methodical response to harassment could outmaneuver fearmongering and bigotry. Some neighbors found inspiration in his steadfast refusal to stoop to her level, others, who had once feared retribution, felt emboldened to stand up for themselves in smaller disputes throughout Bluefield Meadow. Meanwhile, the house Lenora vacated went into foreclosure, rumored to be sold off to cover legal fees and restitution for the damage she caused. Prospective buyers occasionally wandered past, curious about the property's backstory. Some even recognized it from news snippets about the notorious incident. Isaac tried to keep his distance from any sensational retellings, preferring to focus on his detective work and occasional volunteer work in the community. In his spare time, Isaac joined a local outreach group dedicated to combating hate crimes, believing that sharing his experiences could prevent similar situations from festering unchecked. He spoke at a small conference, recapping how one neighbor's hostility, fueled by personal biases, nearly tore apart the sense of security in their quiet corner of suburbia. The message landed strongly: unwavering factual evidence and consistent reporting were crucial to curtailing intimidation. Thus, the final resolution at Bluefield Meadow was twofold. On the legal side, a disruptive figure faced accountability for her misdeeds, sentenced to years behind bars. On the social side, the neighborhood emerged more aware and united, no longer susceptible to a single person's manipulations. And Detective Isaac Barnett, though reluctant to bask in the spotlight, found a renewed sense of purpose, continuing his sworn duty, both as an officer of the law and as a neighbor determined to safeguard the harmony of the place he called home.